India. For some, it's a country of dance, Bollywood, tech startups, and billionaires from the Forbes list. For others, it's the smell of overcrowded trains, the packed slums of Mumbai, and children selling water at busy intersections. Both of these worlds are real. But if we focus on only one of them, we see only half the truth. Because when we ask today why India is poor, few people remember that just 300 years ago, it wasn't. Few people remember that just 300 years ago, it wasn't India trying to catch up with the world. It was a world trying to catch up with India. In the 18th century, the Indian subcontinent was one of the richest regions on the planet. It produced a huge share of the world's manufactured goods, especially textiles. Bengal was so wealthy that European merchants described it as a land of endless abundance, fertile lands, thriving craftsmanship, and ports buzzing with trade between Europe, Africa, and Asia. India had everything: people, land, resources, and a vast internal market. If it had gone through industrialization in the 19th century, the way Britain or later the United States did, its economy today might be worth tens of trillions of dollars. We're talking about a scale comparable to the entire global GDP just a few years ago. And yet, that same country later became associated with famine and poverty, images that for many people in the West almost defined India itself. Today, the situation is paradoxical once again. India's economy is growing at more than 7% per year and has lifted over 400 million people out of poverty in just a few decades, one of the fastest reductions in poverty in human history. At the same time, tens of millions of people still live without reliable access to water, electricity, or healthcare. Young Indians sometimes pay smugglers tens of thousands of dollars to reach the United States illegally because, in a country that has just surpassed Japan to become one of the largest economies in the world, they still struggle to see a future for themselves. So when and why did one of the richest regions on Earth begin to lose its position? The colonial turn. One of the moments many historians point to when explaining India's economic turning point is the year 1757 and the Battle of Plassey in Bengal. It wasn't a world war or a dramatic conquest of the entire subcontinent, but rather a local conflict in which the British East India Company became involved. Officially, it was a trading company. In reality, it was something far more unusual, a corporation with its own army and navy. Few images capture that era better than this. A private company capable of waging war. The British supported one side of the conflict, won the battle, and in return placed a ruler on the throne who was friendly to their interests. That victory opened the door to something much larger. Instead of one massive conquest, British influence expanded slowly and methodically. Local rulers were often given an offer that was difficult to refuse. You keep your title, your palace, and a portion of your prestige, but you play by London's rules. Refusing meant risking the loss of everything. Many chose cooperation. Access to the British trade network and the promise of modernity looked appealing. Over time, however, it became clear that the profits increasingly flowed in only one direction, from India to Britain. The subcontinent gradually began to resemble a patchwork. Some regions were governed directly by the British, while others remained under loyal princes. The economy became more and more tied to the interests of the imperial center. India slowly stopped being a major center of production and instead became a supplier of raw materials and a market for British goods. What had once been one of the pillars of global trade began to lose its economic autonomy. The British finally left in the 20th century, after decades of rising tensions and a growing independence movement. Mass civil disobedience, boycotts, and social pressure made maintaining the empire increasingly expensive and difficult. In 1947, India finally gained independence, but freedom arrived together with division. Pakistan was created. Millions of people were forced to flee their homes, and violence claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The new country was enormous, diverse, and fragile. Many former princely states still had their own local rulers. Linguistic and cultural differences were enormous, and the possibility of further fragmentation seemed very real. The government in New Delhi had to convince regional elites that remaining part of a single country was worth it, so it relied on an argument that works almost everywhere: money. The state began investing heavily in roads, railways, ports, and connections between regions. The logic was simple: If a business owner in one region can easily sell goods in another, everyone earns more. A large integrated market generates far greater profits than many small isolated territories. In a country where more than 100 languages are spoken and where differences between states can sometimes be greater than those between European countries, this was an enormous challenge. But it wasn't only about trade. When people spend their entire lives in one region, they tend to think locally. When they start working, studying, and doing business in other parts of the country, their perspective begins to expand. Independence and a difficult start. But even the broadest thinking won't fill an empty plate. By the late 1940s, around 150 million people were receiving food directly from the state. The daily ration was roughly 1,200 calories, a level of survival, not a normal life. The new country inherited severe shortages, not enough food, not enough goods, and very little modern industry. For decades, India had operated under a colonial economic logic: export raw materials and import finished products. When production couldn't keep up with the demand, the simplest solution was to employ more workers, because labor was abundant. At the same time, Western Europe, the United States, and Japan were investing heavily in machines that allowed a single worker to produce more and more. In India, the population kept growing, but productivity remained largely stagnant. Then came World War II. Industry was redirected toward the war effort, and the civilian economy was pushed into the background. Within just a few years, the population increased by more than 40 million. There were more mouths to feed without a proportional rise in production. Poor harvests only deepened the crisis, and shortages became the norm. By the time India gained independence in 1947, it was an enormous country, roughly 360 million people, but economically weak. If goods are scarce, they must be produced. And to produce them, you need steel mills, power plants, machinery, and infrastructure. In other words, industrialization on a massive scale. And that is where the next chapter of this story begins. The state takes control. After 1947, India faced a fundamental question. How do you build prosperity in a country of 360 million people that starts with shortages of almost everything? The options were limited. The European model relied on colonies, which was hard to copy right after escaping colonial rule. The American model depended on a powerful market, global military reach, and the dollar, things India simply didn't have. That left a third path, a strong state that plans development. The government would decide where to build steel mills, power plants, and factories, inspired by Soviet-style 5-year plans that at the time seemed like a fast route to modernization. The logic in New Delhi was simple. If wealth had flowed to London for centuries, the state now had to ensure profits stayed in India. But India was also a democracy, and democracy meant constant negotiation. Industrialists wanted influence, former princes wanted to keep power, and regions resisted decisions being made entirely in New Delhi. The result was a compromise. The state took control of strategic sectors such as railways, defense, energy, steel, and coal, while private companies were allowed to operate under strict regulations. In practice, this created a maze of license and permits. Starting a factory often required more patience with bureaucracy than real business skill. The system became known as a license Raj, where officials sometimes had more power than entrepreneurs. Economic growth stayed at only a few % per year. With a rapidly growing population, that was not enough. Every year, millions of new workers enter the labor market, and when the economy doesn't grow faster than the population, poverty doesn't shrink, it spreads. State-owned companies rarely failed, even when inefficient, and entire industries such as steel or coal remain expensive and uncompetitive, slowing the whole economy. Private companies also face heavy restrictions. Competition remained limited, access to foreign technology was weak, and innovation moved slowly. Economists later called this the Hindu rate of growth, only a few % per year, far too slow to catch up with the world. The system did have one advantage. India avoided aligning fully with either the United States or the Soviet Union, allowing it to receive aid from both sides during the Cold War. Geopolitically, it was clever, but economically, it wasn't enough. When growth continued to disappoint, policymakers concluded that the problem was not too much control, but too little of it. So the state expanded regulation even further. The result was the opposite of what was intended: more bureaucracy, slower decisions, and declining competitiveness. By the 1960s, India was losing ground in global trade as other countries produced faster, cheaper, and more efficiently. A vicious cycle emerged. Low productivity meant weak exports. Weak exports increased dependence on foreign aid, and that dependence encouraged even more state control. At the same time, countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan were growing much faster, showing that other development models were beginning to produce far stronger results. Slow growth. Washington quickly understood its advantage. If India needed assistance, especially in years when a weak monsoon forced a country to import food, that help could come with conditions: open the market, allow foreign companies to enter, and loosen state controls. The United States was no longer offering only grain, but also technology, modern seeds, fertilizers, and agricultural machinery. For India, this became an opportunity to escape chronic food shortages. This period became known as the Green Revolution, which significantly increased crop yields and finally allowed the country to feed its population more reliably. At the same time, some regulations were softened and joint ventures with foreign companies were permitted. By the late 1960s, economic growth was reaching as much as 7%. For the first time, there was a real sense that India might finally accelerate its development. Then, a new goal emerged: self-sufficiency. After 2 centuries of dependence, the idea of producing everything ourselves sounded extremely appealing. The problem was that the world was becoming increasingly integrated, and countries were beginning to specialize in what they did best. India tried to do everything at once. Despite its enormous agricultural advantages, it did not fully use its potential for many years. Farmers remained dependent on intermediaries, competition was limited, and imports were heavily protected by high tariffs. Industry operated inside a protective greenhouse, shielded from strong pressure to improve quality or innovate. The Green Revolution was a major success, but deeper economic reforms moved cautiously. Political elites were reluctant to lose influence, and liberalization happened only in stages. Meanwhile, countries like South Korea and later China made decisive shifts toward export-driven growth and global competition. India changed more slowly, often only under pressure from economic crisis. When the Soviet Union began weakening in the 1980s and eventually collapsed, India lost an import trading and financial partner. In theory, it could simply turn toward Western markets. In practice, entering those markets required high quality and strong competitiveness, areas where India still struggled. Opening up to the world. In the early 1990s, India found itself in a serious economic crisis. Foreign currency reserves were rapidly shrinking and external support was weakening, which meant reforms are no longer optional. They were necessary. Around that time, India began opening its economy more strongly to the West, but the world's attention was already shifting toward China. Beijing had opened its markets to foreign capital, built special economic zones, and rapidly expanded manufacturing. Made in China products were flooding global markets, and policymakers in New Delhi could clearly see the difference. The challenge was that India started from a different position. In China, industry already formed a much larger share of the economy. In India, it was smaller and surrounded by powerful interest groups that were not eager to face global competition. Turning the country into the factory of the world overnight was far more difficult. Instead, India gradually moved in another direction. Rather than focusing on mass manufacturing, it began exporting services. A huge number of English-speaking graduates, relatively low labor costs, and strong technical universities helped create a boom in IT and outsourcing. Customer support for Western companies was handled in cities like Bengaluru, while software development grew rapidly in places such as Hyderabad. At the same time, the government reduced tariffs and slowly opened the economy to global trade. Cheaper imported components made production more efficient, and the economy began to grow faster. This is how the modern Indian economic model emerged: a strong service sector, a massive internal market, and gradual integration with the global economy. Today, India grows at roughly 6 to 7% per year, attracts international investment, and build strong currency reserves. Yet serious challenges remain: uneven education, infrastructure gaps, and millions of people still living in poverty. For that reason, the question of whether India is poor depends on perspective. In macroeconomic terms, it is becoming much stronger. But in the daily lives of many citizens, poverty is still very real. And that may be the most important part of the story. India's path was never predetermined by geography or culture. It was shaped by decisions, some bold, some cautious, and many made under pressure. Today, the results are visible everywhere. Modern tech offices standing just a few streets away from neighborhoods that still lack basic infrastructure. Both are India, and only together do they tell the full story. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.